I have a revelation for you. Something that you probably would never come to a conclusion that you would never make on your own. Life is not fair. How many of that surprises you? None of it? None of you? I was just sure that I had actually come up with a real revelation that would shock all of you. Life isn't fair. Last couple of weeks, I've had a couple of opportunities to discover just how unfair life can be. The last Windows 10 update, I read on, I think it was maybe Thursday morning, that there were some problems with that update and it had caused some computers to crash. You know what? On Wednesday night, as I was getting ready to leave the office, my computer told me an update is ready. Would you like to install? I said, install and shut down. I get to the office the next morning and I open up my computer and my computer says unable to install the update. Would you like to restore to the previous point? I figured, well, if I can't get the update, I might as well go to the previous point. I go to the previous point and I begin to do some work on the computer. I begin to actually try to load in the sermon stuff and to take it off the recorder and put it onto my computer so that I can take out the dead space and things like that and put it online. And it usually takes about 40 seconds for the transfer from the recorder to my computer. It took over 8 minutes. I figure there's something wrong. I go in to try a couple of other apps, and all of those are working at a pace that is completely intolerable in how slowly everything is moving. So I go, okay, let me do a restore. Let me go ahead and do it. The computer tried to do it, evidently, but it didn't work. Let me try to do it. I go in and try to do a restore. It says, oh, the previous restore point has been erased because the update didn't work. Do you want to reset your computer, which is just reconfiguring, reworking the windows without interrupting your documents? And I say, nothing else is working, I might as well try that. And I reset my computer and I get as it's starting up, I get a blue screen that says, do you want to reset? Do you want to open with a different operating system? And a couple of other choices. I hit reset and I get the same screen. Now I figure, now I got a real problem. Time for me to stop messing with it. Time for me to pack things up and go over to Best Buy. And I take the thing over to Best Buy and I purchase the 1-year plan for unlimited services and things like that, figuring, these things always come in at least 3s. And I give it to them and say, well, it's back to school time. It's going to take a lot longer for us to repair it. Usually we'd have these back to you in 2 days, but since everybody's giving us their stuff because they want to get back to school, it's going to be a week and a half. Oh, great. Okay. Then I get a call, Labor Day morning. We're working on your computer, and we are going to. We figured out that you did have the problem with the update download and all of this stuff, and we have reconfigured that for you. But we tried to recover all of your documents, and they have all been corrupted. Sermons for 13 years, all of my church leadership stuff, all elders' minutes, reports, all those things. Poof. Life's not fair. And then I go out to my car this morning to come, I'm ready for church, I'm ready to come. And this actually would be worse if it was my daughter Elizabeth, because she's the one who has arachnophobia. But I get into my car, and I sit down, and I turn, and I look forward, and I've got one of those quarter-sized spiders hanging right in front of me. You don't get in your car expecting spiders. So I get my ice scraper, and I get the thing out, get the spider webs cleared out. I pull up to the stop sign. I look to my right, and there's another spider hanging in the window over there. Life is just not fair, is it? But when it's most difficult is when it feels like God's not fair. Job felt that. Job felt, God, you're being unfair to me. Why are you doing this to me? Why are you making me go through this? Why of all people am I having to suffer this way? Why are you being so unfair? David says the same thing in several Psalms. God, I see the unrighteous, and they are prospering. They are living well. They are doing great. And here I am stuck in the gutter. God, it's just not fair. Why are you doing this to me? Sometimes we look at things and it just looks like God's not fair. And we want to know why. We want God to be fair. We want God to be a God that has it all figured out, and He treats everyone fairly, and everyone gets what they deserve. Or do we really want that? Jesus told a story that related to the issue of fairness. It really doesn't relate to the issue of fairness, but a key group of people thought it should be an issue of fairness, but it deals with something that we need much more than fairness. Jesus teaches us in Matthew chapter 20 that God is just in never giving us less than we deserve, but gracious in blessing us with what we don't deserve. Yet we find that ourselves sometimes envious of those whom we perceive that God is treating with generous grace. The story begins this way. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and to send them into his vineyard. About 9 in the morning he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. And he told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. He went out again about noon and about 3 in the afternoon and did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing?" "Because no one has hired us," they answered. He said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning from the last ones hired and going to the first." The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came and each received a denarius. So when those who were hired first, they expected to receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. And when they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. These who were hired last worked only 1 hour, they said, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day. But he answered one of them, I'm not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. If I want to give to the ones who hired last the same as I give you, don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last one will be first, and the first will be last. Now, if we were to look at great boss stories, it would depend on which group of these workers that you would ask whether this guy would qualify as a great boss. Those who were hired, yes, would absolutely put him on the number one position of the great boss list. A guy that's going to give me a full day's pay to work 1 hour. But those who worked all day and saw that the 1 hour workers got the same pay as them are much less likely to say, this guy's a great boss, we want to work for him again. And so Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like that. The kingdom of heaven is like working for a boss that some of you will hate and some of you will think is great because of how he treats you. Now, to understand this story, we need to go back to that 7-letter word that I often refer to. That word that's the word that I say you need to practice if you're going to study Scripture. Anybody remember that word? Context. Okay? We've got to set this story down in the midst of the context that occurs to see why Jesus tells this story. Because where he tells it is as informative as the story itself. In chapter 19, Jesus has these women bring their children to him. Now, you need to understand that in Jewish culture, children had no standing. And the mothers that brought them had no standing. I mean, elsewhere, in one of the other Gospels, it says the disciples tried to turn them away. I mean, Jesus is doing important stuff right now. He doesn't have time to bother with you women and children. This is important stuff. This is man stuff. So if you'll just kindly go away, Jesus is too busy for you. Okay? And so as the disciples are trying to usher those women and children off, that Jesus says, hey, let them come over here. And he takes and he blesses the children. He takes and issues God's blessing of peace and prosperity and hope upon them. And then comes this rich young guy. I mean, he's strutting his stuff. He's got it together. He's, in that culture, he was the man. And he comes up to Jesus and says, Jesus, what do I do to get salvation? And Jesus mentions some of the 10 Commandments. And he mentions love others. The guys, I've done all those things. I'm good. Well, there's one last thing. One last thing that you need to do. Go sell everything that you've got, give it to the poor, and then come follow me. You see, at that point, he hits him where he is most vulnerable. Here's a guy that thought he was at the front of the line. And Jesus says, you're a long way from the front of the line. The disciples thought that the women and children belonged at the end of the line, and Jesus says, you have moved to the front. That Jesus takes and he turns over our cultural values and our cultural expectations and says, the things that you have banked on, the things that you have come to know are all wrong. You need to think of things differently if you're going to think in kingdom terms. And so the disciples ask, well, if this rich guy can't get into heaven, because we know that God blesses rich people. You know, prosperity gospel isn't a new thing. Prosperity gospel was present in the first century. The expectation that people who were financially wealthy, it was because of God's blessing upon them. And so the idea here is this rich young guy, he's financially blessed. He must be blessed by God. And you're saying that rich people have trouble getting into heaven? Well, who in the world can get in then? If rich people are going to have trouble, none of us have a chance. But Jesus says, what's impossible for you, what's impossible for humanity, isn't impossible for God. And then Peter asks, what about us? We've given up a whole lot of stuff, Jesus. We've given up our careers. We've given up our families. We've given up a whole lot of stuff to follow you. What are we going to get out of it? And it's out of the context of that question that the story occurs. Jesus is answering Peter's question with a story. Peter, you want to know what you're going to get out of it? Let me tell you. And he tells the story. Right before the story, he makes this statement: many who are first will be last, and the last first. As the story comes to a close, he says, so the first will be last, or the last will be first, and the first last, giving us brackets around which the story is composed. And then right after the story, James and John, their mother, comes to Jesus and says, Jesus, can you do me a favor? Now that's a question that I've learned to always be suspicious of. You don't answer that question. Can you do me a favor? You always have to ask, what is that favor? Jesus, will you do a favor for me? What's the favor? When you come into your kingdom, can one of my sons be on your right hand and the other on your left hand? Can you make my sons the two most important people in your kingdom? That's not for me to a point. But can your sons suffer for me like I'm going to suffer? Are they willing to die for my sake? And then Jesus is entering the city. He comes across two blind men. Have mercy on us. Have mercy on us. And he heals them. Two men shut out, really put outside of community, that being outside of the walls or outside of the city gate, that you enter in, you would do your thing. But really, to say as blind people, they didn't really belong. And so what we have is this arc that begins with those who would be considered last in line, somebody who would be considered at the front of the line, those who were requesting to be at the front of the line, and those who were requesting, because we're at the end, would you help us? And then in the middle we have that story. So let's review the story. See, there's a harvest that needs to be done. It's about this time of year in Judea, that this story would have had its context, that the harvesting of the grapes, the annual harvesting, and what would actually occur is the owner of the vineyard would come into the city square, and like it occurs in a lot of towns that have migrant workers, they would gather at the city square, wait for somebody to come in with their pickup truck and say, you, and you, get in the truck. And they take them out to the farm and they say, here's what you need to do. Okay? That's happening today in California and different other places where migrant workers are being hired. And so that kind of thing was happening in Jesus' day. The guy would come in, I need workers. Okay, first 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and he would count them off. And the grapes needed harvested. You can't. They needed done, and they needed done quickly. And so he goes into the time, and he goes and he gets this collection of laborers. First gets a group at 6 o'clock in the morning. The normal work shift is 6 to 6, 12-hour work day. You come out, you work for 12 hours, you earn a denarius. A denarius was a typical day's wage. And so he's hiring them at a fair wage. A typical day. But he comes back 3 hours later, there's still guys there, he still needs more work done. He gathers some more, says, come on, work in my vineyard. He comes back at noon, still more there. He gathers them, he sends them out. He does it at 3 in the afternoon, he comes back at 5, 1 hour left, and he gathers the rest that are there. Now the rest that are there are probably the people who throughout the day others have avoided hiring. The blind, the lame, the deformed, those that were not useful. And he says, come on. Come out and labor. It's your job, 1 hour, I'll pay you what's right, what's fair. And they go out to work. And so you have this willing employer. Not only willing to hire the people early in the day, but willing to hire those who were unemployable and to put them to work. Those that were considered unworthy, a waste of time, unuseful. And he puts them to work. He finds use for them. He finds value in them, and he puts them to work in his vineyard. But then there's the surprising payday. Typically, what would happen at a payday is those people who had worked the longest, who were hired first, would get paid first so that they could leave. But the owner of the vineyard tells him, he tells his foreman, I want you to turn that around this time. I want you to flip it over. I want you to pay the people who were here first or last. I want you to pay them and let them go. And then pay those who have been here first or got here first last. And so he starts to pay the workers. He pays those people who are hobbling up or having trouble seeing, comes up and gathers their wages, and each of them get a denarius. I'm wondering what went through their mind, thinking, we were only here 1 hour. Why are we getting a full day's wage? Did the foreman, did he make a miscalculation? But also imagine the joy that these people who would typically be unemployed and because of that would be going home that night, usually to tell their wives, well, we got to figure out how we're going to make it through another night without any money. Who can we borrow, beg something from tonight? But they don't have to do that. tonight they have been blessed with a full day's wage. They're going to go home and they're going to celebrate like they have not celebrated in a while. And the others looking at what's going on thinking, all right, 1 hour, full days? And they're beginning to calculate themselves. Okay, I've been here since 3. That means that's 3. Okay, maybe he's going to add an extra bonus. It's not going to be a day per hour, but maybe he'll bonus us some other way. Maybe I'll get an extra one just for that being not the last group. Maybe I'll get 4. We don't know. But they're beginning to tabulate. Those people that have been there the full day are thinking, 12 hours? I got a 2-week vacation coming. But as the foreman continues to pay, and as the work load increased and the money didn't, the cry began to be made, unfair! You're not being fair! Was he? Was the boss fair? They had agreed to work for a day's wages, hadn't they? He is paying them what he agreed to. He is being fair. There is no injustice in what he is doing. Rather than it being injustice, he's decided, I want to be more gracious to those who have greater need. Why do we feel the compulsion to begrudge those who receive grace? And Jesus flips it over and says, those who are last will be first. Now here's some lessons we can learn from this story. First, God's conception of justice is not the same as ours. I mean, he tells that second group, I'll pay you what I consider right. That term right there is the term just or fair. I'll pay you whatever I consider as fair. Now we consider, okay, there's a ledger sheet here that the number of hours, the number of times and all of these things add up, and it gives me a fair wage for you, and then so forth. So we deal with same hours, same pay kind of things, same gender, same pay. No, he's not dealing with those kind of things. He's dealing with, okay, we got all these things line up, and there's a fair wage, and I get that wage. And Jesus says, I'll tabulate it myself. Put away your figures, let me figure this out. You see, what we want often is we want what's fair for us. We want what we consider fair. And so what those workers looked at and saw, these guys are getting the pay that we agreed upon, that's unfair because it doesn't advantage us. It's what you agreed on. It's the fair wage. It's typical market. Jesus is just readjusting the scales. That's why I said, do you want God to be fair? No, because if Jesus was going to, if God was going to treat us fairly by the terms that we want usually to define fairness, none of us would be headed to heaven. All of us would come short because none of us have done enough to earn it. Now, some people have come to this story and talk about, we don't like this parable because it's a wage salvation parable. It's not a wage salvation parable. It's a parable about grace. and God's abundant grace for those who most need it. Those who most need it sometimes are those who most are unaware of their need for it. Jesus had been with Zacchaeus, and the Pharisees were outside in the front yard having their convention to determine, what do we do about Jesus hanging out with such riffraff? And Jesus became aware of the conversation and says, you know, I didn't come for those who were healthy. I came for the sick. Now, some people have thought, okay, Jesus then, and he's saying, I didn't come for you guys. I came for those who are spiritually unhealthy. Jesus isn't saying that. Jesus is saying, I came for all spiritually unhealthy ones. He happens to understand he is. You guys are just oblivious to the fact that you need the help. You see, all of us are those 1 hour workers, really. And God's saying to us, I will treat you justly. I will give you grace. I will extend to you that extra effort, although you don't deserve everything that I'm giving you. That's how God works. God is a God of justice, but He's also a God of grace. And I don't want God treating me with justice or fairly according to my terms. But we also learn that envy is our ungracious resentment of God's grace to others. In the text, he says that they look and they become envious of those who have been working for the 1 hour. Now, the actual term there is a term that Jesus uses back in the Sermon on the Mount when he talks about the unhealthy eye, and it's the evil eye. The evil eye is the one that looks enviously at things that others have and becomes envious of their position and begins to begrudge them because God has been gracious to them. We sometimes have that, don't we? Sometimes when somebody comes to a relationship with Christ and we know that they have been particularly bad people, sometimes we're a little skeptical, aren't we? Sometimes we're a little standoffish. We're going to wait until that person proves that they've really changed their ways. And when they prove that they've really converted, when they prove that they've really given themselves to Christ, then we'll maybe begin to slide in. But you better prove yourself first. I've been here. I've proven myself. You got to do the same thing because I'm keeping an eye on you. That's the eye of envy. The eye of envy that says, I can't extend the same grace towards you that I've received myself. God needs double checked on you. It's a good thing that God has somebody to back him up on this, to make sure that the people that he says he's letting in are actually worthy to be let in. And I'm glad to volunteer for that service. Sometimes we do that. Sometimes we play that role. And we become resentful of those that God has demonstrated grace toward because we forget we received it ourselves. And so really the story comes around to this. Humility is the appropriate posture to receive God's grace. The women and children received God's grace because they understood they didn't belong there. And Jesus welcomed them anyway. The rich young man didn't experience God's grace because he didn't have the humility to say, all of these things don't matter. My wealth is unimportant if I am outside of a relationship with the one who can redeem me. My prosperity and my position, I can't give those up. James and John and the mother have a problem because they want to be in the first positions, the positions of honor. And they're replaced by two blind men who were shut out and shown, here's God's grace at work. Humility is what's important if we're going to be in a relationship with Christ, if we're going to receive His grace. Humility is necessary for us because it's the only way that we'll put up with each other. When we are humble enough to recognize that we ourselves are just as bad as those that we want to put last. That we have no foot up. That we have no position of pride. That we have no place where we can declare our worthiness. That all of us are equally in need of God's grace.